Welcome to yet another session of this particular chapter. Previous chapter we looked at how the blood circulates in the body, what are the different types of circulation, single and the double circulation. Now in this particular session we are going to look at certain aspects of circulation, that is the blood pressure, pulse and the ECG. So what exactly do you mean by these terms and what do we understand by them? So coming to the subtopics for today, what is blood pressure and how do we calculate the blood pressure? So what are the variations you have in this particular pressure, and what exactly is pulse and what will it be different, how will it be different from the blood pressure? Then what is electrocardiogram and electrocardiograph? Now these will be the subtopics for today. So let's go on to the first one. See, onto the screens you have an instrument which actually checks your blood pressure. So many of us know what exactly this instrument is, but we just know it as like blood pressure unit, which helps us to check our pulse and the blood pressure. But how many of us do know that what is the name of this particular instrument and how exactly it works to give out that blood pressure, and how is the variation caused? And how do we have the high pressure and the low pressure variations in this? So to understand this we have to go back to the previous session where we said that there's a heartbeat every minute, 70 to 72 times the heartbeats per minute. Now what exactly a heartbeat we said? We said it's a contraction and relaxation. So whenever there is a blood contraction, the pressure automatically tends to be higher. But when it relaxes, the pressure does come down. So here we have to look at two terms to understand the variations in pressure. First one will be the systolic pressure, which is given here. So the systolic pressure we are talking about. The other one we have to know is the diastolic. Now what is the meaning of this systolic and diastolic? Whenever the blood flows from the auricles or the atrium to the ventricles will open at the same time through the pulmonary artery on the right side and the aorta onto the left side. So when this does, the pressure with which the blood flows from the arteries through the arteries outside of the ventricles, now that will be the pressure which is called as the systolic pressure. So when the blood is getting filled in the ventricles, now ventricles will be full of blood during a certain period of time, and there will be a pressure executed on that particular point. Now the pressure within the ventricles when the blood is completely filling the ventricles, we call it as a systolic pressure. Now that will be at the highest level. Now what is the diastolic pressure then? So the blood will eventually move out by the pulmonary arteries as well as the aorta at the same point. So once the blood gushes out through the various blood vessels, now that ventricles are in a period of relaxation. Now that period of relaxation we call it as diastolic pressure. Technically speaking, the heartbeat is made up of a systole and a diastole, that is the contraction and the relaxation unit. Together we call it as blood pressure. Now what should be the correct amount of systolic pressure and diastolic pressure? Normal healthy individual, the systolic pressure will generally be maintained at 120. That will be the maximum for a normal healthy individual. With the age factor coming up, it might go up to 140. Anything about 140, the pressure is supposed to be high. Similar way, the diastolic pressure will be at 80. That will be normal. So anything above 100, that is 90 to 100, again there is variation. When the blood pressure moves up to 140 on the higher side or 90 to 100 in the lower side, then we give the term the hypertension. Now hypertension in normal terms we call it as BP, or simply we call it as blood pressure. Hypertension, more amount of pressure in the arteries. Now how does this happen? It happens because the arteries actually constrict, they become thinner, and then the pressure exerted inside the blood flow in the arteries becomes higher. When that goes on, automatically the 120 will be lifted up to 140 and the 80 might tune up with the 90 or the 100. The higher levels are less harmful as compared to that of the lower levels of blood pressure. The variations in the lower level are much more harmful. So we have to keep this particular levels in the same way, because that will be called as hypertension, and there are a lot of other effects through the hypertension. Now, how exactly this happens, we will be looking at the diagram wise here. So you can see that an instrument has been put onto the hand. Now, generally we take the arm portion and then it is cuffed at the junction of the elbow as well as the shoulder level. Now, here the cuff is inflated, that is, air is passed through and it's made tight at its junction. When it becomes tight, the flow of blood will be lifted up to the level here, and here the artery gets closed at this point because the pressure is already reached to that higher level. Now, this will be the first step after the rubber cuff has been inflated with air. Now, what happens once this is done and the pressure cuff above 120 it reaches, slowly the cuff will be released little by little so that the pressure slowly falls back to its normal levels, and then the blood starts flowing inside the arteries. Now, when that falls, the highest level, so where it goes up, we call it as the higher pressure, that is the systolic pressure. So when you release, there will be a stethoscope to hear the sounds by placing it on that particular arm. Now, there will be a lot of audible sounds which are given. That's the artery, the blood flowing in the arteries. That sound will be given in this particular place. Now, what happens? Once it is being released, after a certain period of time, the blood from the upper level to the lower level is continuous and the sounds do get stopped. At this junction, when the sounds stop, you will check the pressure there at that lowest level. Now, if it is 120 by 80, it is normal. If it is more than 140 or more than 90 to 100 here, then we will check it for a few days and then we will consider the patient to be having this hypertension. So, hypertension is just not like BP or something, but it is also not good for other organs. It creates a lot of problems with the other organs. The working of the heart, there might be heart blocks, the blood flow, the pulse rates, all these things will change when you have BP. So let's not make it to that level, let's keep it at the same level. Now, this is all about blood pressure, and we never talked about what is the instrument called till now. The instrument where you check the blood pressure, we call it as the sphygmomanometer. Now, this sphygmomanometer will be the instrument which is normally called as a BP machine. Now, we check the pressure in mm of mercury. So, mercury is supposed to be the measurement for pressure. So, we generally write it as 120 by 80 and we take it in the form of mm of mercury, because this will be the pressure count for this particular BP levels. Now, the upper one is called the systolic pressure, the lower one we call it as the diastolic pressure. Now, this is all about the blood pressure. Now, let's try to understand what exactly is the difference between the blood pressure as well as the pulse. Now, that will be the next topic for us. Let's take up the pulse first. Now, what is exactly is pulse and what was BP we defined of? Now, there is a difference between the blood pressure and the pulse when we are talking about. Now, blood pressure will be the pressure of the arteries when the blood flows in the arteries and it hits the walls of the blood vessels. So, the pressure obtained by hitting the walls of the blood vessels when the blood is flowing into those vessels is called the blood pressure, the way it hits the walls of that particular vessels. Now, pulse will be the throbbing portion. We call it as throbbing because in arteries we already understood that the blood flow is not even, it is intermittent, and that intermittent type of flowing we call it as throbbing. Now, what happens whenever the heart contracts and relaxes and the blood gushes out of the ventricles? Now, the arteries blood also flows intermittent with that throbbing kind inside the blood vessels. Now that intermittent flow, as when the heart contracts and relaxes, the flow of blood into the arteries also happens at the same point where the heart is contracting and relaxation. So the pulse will be the flow of blood in that blood vessels, that is arteries, when the heart is contracting and relaxing. So according to that level, the flow of the blood in the arteries also happens, that intermittent or throbbing. Now that we call it as pulse, and technically speaking, the number of heartbeats per minute, that is the contraction relaxation, will be equivalent of the blood flow in the arteries. So that will be called as the pulse. So the heartbeat and the pulse, the count will always be similar. The count will also be similar. That is, it is also 70 to 72 beats per minute. Here, the pulse is also the same rate. But what happens sometimes, the heart beats normally, but the pulse might be having a variation and vice versa. Now this happens because there will not be a coordination between the heartbeat and the flow of blood in arteries, maybe for various reasons. There are conditions where you can have a low pulse and a normal heartbeat also. So that will be the difference between pulse, and pulse generally can be checked at 7 different regions. But when you go to a doctor, the first thing he does is to check your pulse at this hand portion, that is at this wrist portion. Now this will be the portion where it is being checked. And why do we check here? So when we studied arteries, we generally come to know the arteries are deeply seated, that we cannot see them externally. The veins are the ones which are more visible onto the as green colored or bluish green parts. Now this particular artery in the wrist is called the radial artery. Now this radial artery is superficial as compared to that of other arteries. So we can still feel a pulse at this particular portion. So that's why doctors check your pulse at this wrist region. Now that pulse rate and the heartbeat go hand in hand. So with that calculation per minute, they will understand whether your heart is functioning normally or not. So that will be the difference between blood pressure and pulses. Now coming to the next one. What you see on the screens is called an ECG. The full form of ECG here is electrocardiogram. And the instrument which does this graphing, we call it as an electrocardiograph. So the graph is the instrument, and the gram will be technically the graph which is being produced from that instrument. Now here, what do you understand by all these complexes? So when it comes out as a graph, we have 3 different regions here at this particular place. Now what are the 3 different regions what we are talking about? So we have a PR interval given here, and then you get into a PR segment here. Now you can see there is a raise in the level at the QRS complex, and then it is coming back to the ST segment. Now this one will be the initiation of the increase of contractions when the blood is getting slowly filled in the auricles, that is the atrium. So slowly it is giving, and the pressure also increases bit by bit. Now the highest levels will be of the ventricular contractions. So this region, what we call as the QRS complex, will be the place where there is maximum pressure. Now once the blood moves out of the ventricles, then it comes back to the normal position. Now with this graph variations and how they are taking this levels, that is sometimes you can have more of this PR intervals, you can have more of QRS complexes, or you can have an ST segment more. So depending upon the graph, how it is actually being given on that particular, given by the particular instrument, we will know whether the person's heartbeat is normal or not. So this particular structure or the graph which is given will help you to understand the condition of your heart. So this is an ECG. which is important for checking the heartbeat and as well as the pulse, so that we will know that heart is working or normally functioning. So this is one of the ways to check if there are any blocks in the heart. That is, hearts do have blocks because of higher BP or cholesterol, the fat deposits in that particular heart vessels. So to check all these things, the ECG will be really helpful. Now electrocardiogram is that in graph what we are getting, and electrocardiograph will be the name of the instrument, so please don't confuse. It's the other way we are taking it up. So this is about ECG. So with this understanding, let's look at few diseases we generally come across in the circulatory system. The first and foremost, we have already seen BP and the pulse rate. So these two are common, which actually happens. Hypertension is a normal one. Okay, many people do get nowadays, and as the age factor goes up, the blood pressure also slowly increases up to 140 like that. So that is a normal during aging. Now apart from that, you have the heartbeat sometimes beating faster, and you have so many diseases with that particular, and heart failures, heart attacks, and you have blocks in, so cholesterol blocks, fat deposit blocks. So the blocks you can all remove by certain kinds of angiogram. So angiogram will help you to remove the blocks. It will make you understand where the blocks are, and you can actually remove the heart blocks. So heart blocks, heart attacks, heart not being beating the similar way, or the pulse variations, the blood pressure and heart attack, and all these things will be some of the diseases we do come across. So sometimes when there is a problem with the heart, they all check with all these kinds of electrocardiograms, and you can also have a scan, a CT scan and all that being taken. Now this is all about the ECG, and this is all the various types of diseases we generally come across. Okay, now with that understanding, let's take up few questions. The first question will be, what is systole and diastole? So systole is the upper level of the blood pressure, and the diastole is the lower one. It is given as 120 by 80. So 120 is the systolic pressure and 80 will be the diastolic pressure, and this is all measured in mercury levels. Now next one, what is the difference between pulse and pressure? Pulse will be the flow of blood in the arteries, the intermittent flow as in when the heart contracts and relaxes. Now blood pressure will be the pressure with which the blood flows in the arteries hitting against the walls of that particular blood vessels. So that will be the difference. Now what is the function of ECG? ECG will help you to form a graphic representation of how your heartbeat works, and ECG full form is electrocardiogram, and this will help you to understand how your heart functions and if there are any variations in your heartbeat or if there are any blocks in that particular area. Now this is all about this particular topic as of now, and this will be the end of this particular session. That is what we have taken as blood circulation. Next session we are going to look at the last topic of this chapter or life processes, that is excretion. So that will be our topic in the next session. So thanks for watching and thank you.